I want to begin this morning by telling you this story. This is a story from a very different place, and a very different place in my life. It was about 15 years ago, and I was out with a couple of friends at this grubby pizza joint in downtown Boston. It was about 2 a.m, so all of the downtown bars had just closed, and the pizza place was getting pretty crowded. We were all packed in there together. This was back in the pre-coronavirus world when you could still do that sort of thing. And so my friends and I ended up pressed up pretty close to this pair of guys who were standing there eating their terrible pizza, and they were comparing tattoos. I remember one of them had a triple rat tail. Like, if you remember the rat tail haircut, he had 3. Because one just couldn't be enough for him. And so these guys, they were showing each other their tattoos, and they both had tattoos that were in Japanese kanji, which neither of them could read, so they had to translate them to each other. And it was mostly the sort of standard tough guy stuff. One guy was like, this one means emperor, and this one means scorpion, and that kind of thing. And then the guy with the triple rat tail showed he had these tattoos on the bottoms of his hands. And he said, they mean create and destroy, because that's what I do. That's what I do. I create and I destroy. And the other guy's mind was blown. He was like, yeah, that is what you do. Right? Like, it was the most profound thing that he had ever heard. And so it was, it was an interesting thing to watch, right? Because they were reading each other these things that were on their bodies, but they couldn't read them on each other or even really on themselves, right? So they had something close to a shared language, but they had no access to that language. And so I've been thinking about this story recently because, I remember watching these guys at the time and thinking their tattoos were almost sublimely lame. I have since myself gotten some questionable tattoos that make me rethink that. But the guy with the create and destroy, right? That's kind of interesting, and it's been on my mind lately. Right? In a time where it feels like there's destruction happening all around us, it's interesting to think about that destruction going hand in hand with creation. And this relationship between destruction and creation, it's built into the very foundation of many faith movements, right? Many religions have a sacred text that begins with some kind of story or narrative about how the world was created. And many religions also include some kind of story about how the world will someday end. Right? The very first lines of the Bible talk about this, right? The Bible starts, in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and the darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind of God swept over the face of the waters. And there's a lot to unpack there. But just starting at the first line, in the beginning, there's a surprising amount of controversy about what that line really means, right? There's, we have our kind of mainstream American Christian point of view, which would be that line means in the beginning of time, before literally anything else. But there's also a school of thought that says that line means something more like when our story begins, in the beginning of what we're going to talk about right now. This has been debated hotly for centuries. And it has a profound impact on the rest of the book, right? I usually think that linguistic arguments about individual biblical lines are a complete waste of time, but this distinction really does matter, right? It matters whether the book is claiming to start at the beginning of all that is, or simply at the beginning of one story. The Bible goes on to say that in this beginning, everything was a formless void. The Hebrew is everything was tohu vavohu, which means something more like all was in chaos, all was mixed up, and the breath of God was on the water. And so the creation story in Genesis, then, is a story of order being created out of chaos, right? It draws an important connection between this dichotomy between creation and destruction and the dichotomy between order and chaos. And it's also important to notice that the chaos is happening on the water, because it's a very common biblical motif for water to represent chaos, right? We tend to associate water with representing life, right, which it can also do. Prophets say drink from the water of life, and the Christian sacrament of baptism, which was probably appropriated from the Jewish tradition of the mikveh, is all about surrounding someone with water that represents new life, and it goes on. But biblical waters can also represent chaos and destruction, right? I'm thinking about the great flood before Noah's Ark, and the storm on the Sea of Galilee, and the water of the Red Sea that parted to let the Jewish people escape and then drown the Egyptian army, which made that, a source of life and destruction. And this is what makes River Sunday kind of interesting to me every year, right? This is the Sunday when we celebrate water, and we celebrate water because it's essential for the creation and existence of life. Our church is on this river where we watch the water go by when we can meet in the building. But water can also destroy basically anything if you give it enough time. Water creates caves and valleys, right? Water can wash away entire communities in a day. I think it says something important about the human experience, that we are so inextricably linked to something so dangerous. I think our human relationship to water is a reminder that the capacity to destroy and the capacity to create are both forces that exist inside of us at all times, regardless of whether or not we acknowledge them. They may not be tattooed on our hands in a language that we haven't bothered to learn, but they are permanently attached to us in ways that we don't always take the time to consider. And I think that's worth exploring, especially in the times that we are living in. We would all do well to consider what human beings do, what human beings are capable of. Because we are living in a chaotic time, aren't we? We're living in a time that feels chaotic and destructive. It feels all tohu vavohu. We're experiencing a global pandemic that is raging out of control, that is taking hundreds of thousands of human lives and laying bare the already horrific inequalities in our country and in our world. We're experiencing a massive economic crisis and a renewed struggle against systemic racism and injustice. I was thinking about this. Last year, when I preached on River Sunday, I said that we were living in a difficult time, which seems kind of quaint now, right? Given that last year I looked at a room full of people who could safely sit next to each other and told them in person that we were living in a difficult time. And then I compared the time that we were living in to other difficult times in history, and both of the historical times that I chose were epidemics. And I stood in front of these elbow-to-elbow people, and I was like, well, this might look grim, but think about these epidemics. The sermon hasn't aged super well, is what I'm saying. But this is a difficult time, and it is a chaotic time, and part of what makes this time so scary and so traumatic is the chaos of it, right? There's so much that we just don't know, and so many people in positions of authority who seem comfortable with us just not knowing, and so perfectly willing to just kind of let it all fall apart. I got to tell you, I am scared of leaders who want to systematically and intentionally cause harm. But I'm becoming even more afraid of leaders who have just relinquished all control, who have just kind of decided to let it all fall apart and descend into chaos. This is right, this is why people like conspiracy theories. This is why people make up conspiracy theories and post them on the internet, because there's a way in which it's kind of comforting to think, well, we can make up a story about how the coronavirus was created in a laboratory by the government, because then at least somebody was in charge, right? And that is in some ways less frightening than the idea that we live in a world where this kind of thing can just happen, right? We live in a world where we can suddenly go from a moment of relative peace and tranquility to a moment when darkness covers the face of the deep and the waters of chaos and destruction threaten to wash it all away. But the good news is that while our sacred texts provide us with examples of times of difficulty and chaos and destruction, they also provide us with examples of how we can respond to that chaos. The Bible begins with this image of the waters being in chaos, but it ends, and this is the other thing that I talked about last year in the sermon that didn't age well, it ends with the image of a beautiful river flowing by the throne of God, and it's cyclical in that way. We begin with the waters in chaos, and we spend the entire book inching our way towards a place of order and peace. And so the people who are in the camp that says that in the beginning really just means when our story begins, they might say that the river at the end of the Bible will someday go back to the chaotic, formless void that we see on the first page, and then the whole thing will start over again. And I love that perspective, because that story, that structure, that is the structure of human societies and human lives. We move through cycles of order and chaos, of creation and destruction, right? This is the real wisdom of the guy with the tattoos and the 3 rat tails, right? Acts of creation and destruction are quite literally what human beings do. They are built into us. His mistake wasn't that he got cheesy hand tattoos. His mistake was that he didn't take the time to learn the language, that he didn't take the time to look at the creation and destruction in the world and in himself and recognize them for what they are, because that is our task now. In this moment of so much pain and chaos, this moment when we are surrounded by so many examples of the human capacity to destroy, this is a moment for us to see in ourselves and in our world that we also have the capacity to create. We can point to all of the countless examples of people who are really leaning into the terror of this time and taking this opportunity to try and destroy more things like the Postal Service and TikTok and democracy. But there are also so many examples that are really worth paying attention to, of people who are taking this moment as an opportunity to create. I'm thinking about all the people who are taking the time to make face masks and give them out to people who need them. We have a bunch of those people in this congregation. During this pandemic, people have created entire justice movements. People have created new tools and avenues for the justice movements that we already had, so that those movements can work and thrive even in the age of social distancing. This is a moment when we have seen people create forces for love and justice in this world that would previously seem impossible, even right here Our own Church of the River staff have worked so unbelievably hard in the past few months to reimagine the ways in which our congregation comes together. People sometimes compliment me on everything our congregation has been doing in the past few months, but truly, Chris, Lisa, Chuck, Cindy, Debbie, Kyle, Mary, Hal, Zara, Lindsay, everybody on the staff has been doing the work of reimagining the ways in which we come together. What you don't see on these Sunday morning services is the studio that Chris has built in our sanctuary with cameras and lighting and a whole thing. And in this time of destruction, there is no act of creation that is too small to make a real meaningful difference. A few weeks ago, Sandra and I had the opportunity to be part of a drive-through, socially distant baby shower that our friends Lillian and Phil created for us. And, it was great. We sat there, and our friends and members of the congregations that we served drove through, and they said hello, and they gave us wonderful gifts. And one of the members of this congregation's youth group gave us a baby blanket that she had knitted herself. She taught herself to knit while she was home under quarantine, and she'd spent our Zoom youth group meetings working on this blanket for Sandra and I to give our child. And I remember on the drive home, Sandra just wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and said, I can't believe that she made this for us. As far as acts of creation go, the blanket it's comparatively small, but the impact that it had was real, because the patterns of creation and destruction, of order and chaos, they're not only cyclical, they're also progressive, right? Every time we create a new world out of the chaos that is surrounding us, we have the opportunity to create a world that is more loving and more just than the world that we knew. That night, we got home from the baby shower and we unloaded all of the fabulous gifts that we had received, and I took that blanket that youth had made for us and I draped it over the back of the rocking chair in the nursery. And I thought, we are going to create a better world. All of us together, we are going to do our own small part to create a world that looks less like the waters of chaos and more like the river by the throne of God. And someday that world may be challenged, and then we will create again, because that's what we do. Amen.